There's something that has stayed with me for years, a quiet observation I made long before I started researching it seriously. I noticed that some people reach their 60s and 70s with sharp, clear eyes. They read without squinting. They drive at night without hesitation. They recognize faces across a room without leaning forward. And then there are others, sometimes younger, who struggle to read a menu, who carry reading glasses in every pocket, who describe the world around them as gradually becoming softer, more uncertain, more blurred. For a long time, I assumed this was simply genetics. Some people get lucky, some don't. That was the easy answer, and for a while I held on to it. But then I came across something that made me stop and look more carefully. I was reading a report, not a mystical text, not a spiritual guide, but a straightforward anthropological observation about communities living in the Tibetan highlands. Researchers studying aging patterns in isolated monastic populations had noted something unusual. The monks in these communities, many of them well past 50, 60, even 70 years old, demonstrated visual acuity that was statistically better than expected for their age group. Not miraculous, not supernatural, just consistently better. And the question that immediately formed in my mind was simple. Why? That question changed the direction of everything I was paying attention to. I want to be honest with you from the beginning. I am not here to tell you that monks have discovered a secret the rest of the world has been hiding. That is not what this is. What I found, after months of reading, conversations with professionals, and honest reflection, is something far more grounded and, in many ways, more hopeful. Because it suggests that the way we treat our eyes every single day matters far more than most of us have ever been told. Let me take you back to the moment this became personal for me. I was 49 years old when I first noticed it. That slight delay when my eyes tried to shift focus from a screen to something across the room. A fraction of a second longer than it used to take. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to notice. I mentioned it to a friend and she laughed. "Welcome to your 50s, she said. Everyone around me treated it as inevitable, a given. Something you just accept and eventually manage with a prescription. But I kept thinking about those monks. I started speaking with Dr. Ethan Walker, a researcher with a background in visual neuroscience and integrative health, who had spent time studying aging and sensory function across different populations. What he told me in our first conversation reframed everything. He said, and I remember this clearly, that the eye is not a passive organ. It is dynamic. It responds to how we use it, what we feed it, how much rest we give it, and what kind of light environment we expose it to across years and decades. The lens, the retina, the macula, these structures are living tissue, and like all living tissue, they are affected by lifestyle. He explained something that I had never fully understood before. The retina, particularly the macula at its center, is one of the most metabolically active tissues in the entire human body. It consumes enormous amounts of oxygen and nutrients to function. And because of that activity, it is also highly vulnerable to something called oxidative stress, the accumulation of free radicals that damage cells over time. Every hour you spend under harsh artificial light, every meal lacking in protective antioxidants, every night of poor sleep. These are not neutral events for your eyes. They accumulate. They compound. And over years, they show up as exactly the kind of visual decline that most people assume is just aging. This is where the connection to monastic life began to make quiet sense. The environment that Tibetan monks traditionally inhabit is, almost by accident, protective of visual health in several meaningful ways. Their daily rhythm involves consistent exposure to natural light. Outdoor light, soft morning light, the kind of full-spectrum illumination that regulates circadian function and supports the production of dopamine in the retina, which research has linked to the healthy development and maintenance of eye structure. They are not staring at backlit screens for 12 hours a day. They are not subjected to the relentless visual demand that defines modern life. Their diet, rooted in whole foods, includes significant amounts of dark leafy vegetables, berries, and plant compounds rich in lutein and zeaxanthin, two carotenoids that deposit directly into the macula and act as a kind of internal filter and antioxidant shield. Studies published in journals like Investigative Ophthalmology and Visual Science have documented the protective role of these nutrients in reducing the risk of macular degeneration and age-related visual decline. These are not exotic compounds. They are found in kale, spinach, eggs, corn, and orange peppers. The monks were not taking supplements. They were simply eating food that happened to be protective. And then there is the practice of intentional rest. In monastic traditions, periods of stillness and meditative focus are not luxuries, they are structural parts of the day. From a purely physiological perspective, what this means for the eyes is significant. The ciliary muscles, the tiny muscles inside the eye responsible for adjusting the lens to shift focus, are in a state of chronic contraction when we spend extended periods looking at close distances, particularly screens. This is the mechanism behind what optometrists call accommodative stress, and it contributes to eye fatigue, headaches, and over time, changes in how the eye functions. Regular periods of looking at distant objects, resting the gaze in open space, allowing the eyes to relax their focus, these are not mystical acts. They are physiological recovery. One principle that researchers have found particularly relevant is what is sometimes called the 20-20-20 rule. Every 20 minutes of near work, look at something 20 feet away for at least 20 seconds. Simple. Almost embarrassingly simple. And yet most of us go entire days without doing it once. For those who want to better understand how to improve vision, reduce blurry sight, and discover habits that help protect eye health over time, we left a complete guide in the first link in the description. It expands naturally on everything we are discussing here. What I began to understand, slowly and then all at once, is that the monks were not doing one extraordinary thing. They were doing many ordinary things, consistently across their entire lives. Natural light in the morning, meals built around whole, nutrient-dense foods, periods of visual rest throughout the day, minimal exposure to the kind of chronic visual stress that defines contemporary life. No single habit was the answer. The answer was the pattern. Dr. Walker made a point that I keep returning to. He said that most people treat their eyes as output devices, things that just work, until they don't. We treat them reactively. We notice the blur, we get a prescription, and we assume the story ends there. But what the research on visual aging increasingly suggests is that the eye responds to care. Not dramatically, not overnight, but measurably over time. The people who maintain better visual function into later life tend to be the people who have, knowingly or not, been doing the protective things consistently. There is also a conversation worth having about stress. Chronic psychological stress elevates cortisol, which affects blood flow and inflammation throughout the body, including in the delicate vascular structures that supply the retina. The relationship between systemic inflammation and age-related eye conditions like macular degeneration and glaucoma is an area of active research, and while the science is still developing, what is already clear is that the body is not compartmentalized. What affects your cardiovascular system affects your eyes. What affects your stress levels affects your biology. The monk's contemplative lifestyle is not incidentally healthy. It is structurally so. I started making changes, small ones at first. I moved my morning routine outside, spending the first 20 minutes of daylight without sunglasses, letting natural light reach my eyes in the way that supports healthy circadian and retinal function. I added more dark leafy greens to my diet, not as a supplement strategy, but as a consistent habit. I set a reminder to look away from my screen every 20 minutes. I reduced the brightness of my devices at night. None of these changes required anything extraordinary. What they required was attention, and the belief that the effort was worth making. That belief, I think, is what separates the people who age well from those who don't. Not luck, not genetics alone. Attention, consistency, the quiet discipline of doing the right small things, day after day. If you want to learn practical ways to maintain good vision, avoid cataracts, and discover which vitamins help support your eye health, we placed a simple guide in the first link in the description that summarizes everything in a clear and practical way. What I came to understand, and what I hope stays with you, is that your vision at 60, at 70, at 80, is being shaped right now. By the light you sit under, by the food on your plate, by how often you rest your eyes and how much time you spend outdoors. The monks did not have a secret. They had a way of living that happened to protect something most of us take for granted until it begins to fade. The clarity of your world tomorrow is, in part, a consequence of the habits you build today. If this kind of content speaks to you, honest, research-grounded, told in a way that connects real life to what science is learning, then I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel. There is much more ahead. We are continuing this journey through health, longevity, and the small decisions that turn out to matter most. Subscribe, so you are there when the next chapter unfolds. because the story is only just beginning.